There is a legend of a man in a cabin, a man in a cabin full of music and musings. Come with us as we once again descend into Capron's cabin.
Hello, welcome to Capron's Cabin. I'm your host, Corey Capron. Hope everyone's doing well tonight. It's always night at the cabin, even when I say it's day, it's sort of like Antarctica. With me this evening is a fellow member of the Pretentious Nerds, Chris DickRson of Expert Consultant. How are you doing today, Chris? Tonight?
Pretty well. It's a little moist, but I like it.
Yes, we like the moist. It does well with the electronics. All right, so this is going to be one of the first two-part crossovers.
Ooh, collaboration.
Yeah, but yeah, we've talked about DC and parallel universes and stuff enough. It was bound to happen. So, of course, Expert Consultant. Your focus is primarily on video games.
Yes.
A lot of my focus is on film. So kind of the obvious thing to talk about would be movies based on video games. However, that's covered a lot, and maybe we will someday down the road. But I was more interested in kind of exploring the history of video games based on movies. And there's kind of three names we kind of use interchangeably for that, which is, like I said, based on movies, which is pretty neutral. Tie-ins, which, kind of imply there can be some negative connotations to that, but it can also just be what it is. And but again, we think of them as more like merchandise and adaptations. And adaptations comes with a lot of expectations built around it to be something that's more of a complete, carryover of the text. But however you want to call them, whatever you want to include in that pile or, exclude in that pile, they've been around since the beginning of gaming. They're still out there now.
They're harder to find nowadays, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, there's some things that, like, I was going to ask you before because I haven't played it, but the two big Spider-Man games that have come out recently, the Spider-Verse, are they tied to Into the Spider-Verse? Because we got the Miles Morales one. Okay, so those aren't even. I was thinking
they're their entirely own thing. I think, like I know it was spread around for a while. I don't think it's working out, but for a while they wanted to kind of create a Marvel video game verse. I think it's called Marvel verse. There is a term for it.
the Marvelverse
is not working out. The Avengers game was supposed to be tied into it, but they kind of said no. So it didn't work out, but it's a cool idea.
Okay. It's sort of like when they were trying to do the dark cinematic monster verse. They were like, it's going to begin with Dracula Untold. And Dracula Untold came out, and they're like, Dracula Untold is not part of the dark verse. It's going to begin with the Mummy. Then the Mummy came out, and they're like, you know what, we quit.
Yeah. Oh, I love it.
So anyway, yeah, I think it's, we've got, because it does go all the way back to the beginning of video gaming, we've got a lot of history to cover. And I figured on the cabin, we'd kind of look at, the early stuff. I whenever you're trying to figure out how, I guess the big question of these two-parters is going to be, how do you make a good video game based on a movie?
Yeah.
And so what I kind of want to do today is, or tonight, because it's always night, even though the sun is shining. It's not shining. This is a break in the fourth wall. Deal with it. Is I like to, go back as far as you can in history to whenever something you're looking at starts to break apart into its core elements. So for that, I kind of want to talk about, even as far back as like Atari, because going all the way back to Atari, there's one very infamous one we all know, which is the ET that caused the crash of '83 because it was the biggest bombing game ever. But you look that up on the internet. Angry Video Game Nerd did an episode on it. Everyone's done an episode on it. It's a well covered topic.
Yeah.
But going back to what's interesting is when you look at gaming at that point, because of the technological and graphical limitations, a term like adaptation, doesn't feel remotely intuitive. You can't, take a text and put it into that kind of game. So instead, what a lot of them did was highlight a moment or the basic concept, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the game, because yes, there was a children's Atari game of Texas Chainsaw Massacre where you played Leatherface.
Oh man, I did not know this.
Killed people with a chainsaw to get points, and that was the entire game. You ran around a field in Texas and shot people up. Of course, realistically, it's like 8 pixels that are the same color, making probably like 24 pixels, making up this blob that is Leatherface with this troublingly like bumpy phallic thing sticking out in front of him that he's just like go chainsaw some people.
The years before the rating system.
But part of the reason we ended up getting one. No, that was when the 2600 was kind of in this glut of people forget the Atari had over 400 games. Most of them were bad knockoffs. And so as much as people like to blame E.T. for the crash of '83, a lot of it was also just saturation of the market with poor material. And, that definitely was a big financial blow to Atari making that game, but also the writing was on the wall. But back on topic, you'd either take a concept like that where you're not dealing with the story, but you're dealing with this piece, or you would just take a scene, like in the first Star Wars game, or I'm pretty sure it's the first. Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back for the 2600 and the Intellivision.
The Hoth battle.
Yeah, it's just the Hoth battle.
Yeah.
So, and a curious thing about that game and a lot of games was, going back then, this term tie-in, we use it as a dirty word for merchandising, or merchandising we use as a dirty word for tie-in. A lot of these games, when we're trying to understand how they work in relation to the movie, I think it's useful to point out that Star Wars Empire Strikes Back was created by Parker Brothers, a toy company. Nintendo, right before Nintendo became Nintendo as we know it, was a toy company. It was a card company before that, but a lot of games back then, we kind of grasp this idea now, but because games have become such a large, expansive, universe of their own, it's kind of hard to think of them like toys, but a lot of those early games are almost like action figures. You get like the Alan Grant from Jurassic Park that froze the net, and you get this T-Rex that has battle damage, and this T-Rex that has, it's so the first stage of gaming, like I said, it was almost always just a part of the game, and then Nintendo would come along, and the second wave of consoles. And it really wouldn't be until Super Nintendo that we started seeing robust narratives like Final Fantasy VI and stuff like that. Um, but you are starting to go from how can we, you know, distill the story to a key part to how can we make the story fit into a game with multiple parts. Um, so really, this is when we start to see kind of a phenomenon of what I call scene dilation. Like if you're watching a movie and there's well, a really good example would be the movie True Lies with Arnold Schwarzenegger that James Cameron did. There's a part in it where he's chasing a terrorist through New York, and they go through the park, and he gets on a horse and runs through the park, and then gets back out on the road. So when they made the True Lies video game, because there's only like 3 or 4 action sequences in the whole movie, that park became a level. Um, you know, you walked around the park, you shot people in the park, you. So we start to see sometimes the way it adapts, and this becomes more and more the case as gaming evolves. Because nowadays, for example, a 3 hour. We were just talking about Justice League being absurdly long for being 4 hours. However, if you bought a 4 hour video game, you would complain that you didn't get your money's worth, that it was very short. And that was kind of the same thing, you know, the expectation of playtime for a game beyond just trial and error repetition just kind of exponentially grows with each development. Like right now, what would you say is like consider like the expectation? I mean, I know different genres have different expectations, but like what's the ideal playtime for a game nowadays? Do you think?
That's something I've written about actually.
Oh, cool.
Like games, in my opinion, are too long today.
Mm-hmm.
The ideal game that most people for $60, that's not indie, a full 60, the expectation is around 15 plus hours. It can go to
Yeah.
like 15 to 100. I think, just as a side note, I think the perfect game is about 8 to 15 hours. But I past 15, it depends on the genre, but starts getting
Sure.
draining.
Yeah, like I mean, like RPGs can go forever,
Oh yeah.
but yeah, if you have something that's very narrative driven, ideally you want the possibility of finishing it in a day, or 2 days, if you were able to just like hardcore binge it, as opposed to something like 70 hours, which is physically impossible.
Yeah.
But so that was one trend I noticed was that that switch back and forth between initially gaming was too small for story narratives, and then it almost became too big, and so
There's a lot of bloat nowadays.
yeah. So that's one kind of interesting challenge with them. A few of the other not necessarily challenges, but some of the things I noticed in the different ways games of this type traits they tend to have. A lot of them are what I'd call multimodal games because most movies have kind of a variety of action sequences. Like, say, like a James Bond movie, you have a gunfight, and then maybe you have an underwater fight, and then maybe you have a car chase. So when you a lot of game movie adaptations, especially like around the Nintendo era, you see different modes of play start to emerge. So one level will be a side scroller, and another level will be a rail shooter, sort of like Battletoads or something like that. So a lot of them tended to be multimodal, which I think probably evolves nowadays starting around like Rockstar. Well, actually, no, probably around Ocarina of Time, to being like more kind of like side quests, but again, it tends to not just be one style of play. Not always, but as a trend. Another trend that they tend to have is a lot of them, this goes back to Atari, when they are trying to do something a little more expansive than, you know, a guy running around with a chainsaw killing people for points, they tended to be scavenger hunts or Easter egg hunts. And it's a very common trope in early gaming, and it still exists to this day. To beat the game, you have to find all of the, hidden eggs or hostages, or, on one extreme, you have things like Final Fantasy, where it's more of a core plot thing. You must get the 4 crystals of the elements or the 4 orbs. But with Nintendo games like Nightmare on Elm Street, you had to get which was based on Nightmare on Elm Street 3. You had to get all of the bones of Freddy from around the town and gather them together to destroy him once and for all. I think a similar thing to like Castlevania with the orbs or the bones of Dracula, Simon's Quest, that is.
Yeah, I never played any Castlevania before Symphony of the Night, so
I mean, hot take, Symphony of the Night is where it becomes amazing. I would recommend Super Castlevania. Beyond that, you're getting into a little bit of hardcore nostalgia. There's a certain
I've dabbled.
Yeah, there's a certain difficulty threshold to some of those. And, in fairness, like, there's some stuff right before Symphony of the Night, like Ronaldo of Blood, that's, you're in the same ballpark. So, like, the immediately adjacent stuff, sure, but, like, I think Simon's Quest and Castlevania 3 is fun. I'm talking myself out of this. But anyway, all right. So, yeah, scavenger hunts. So, yeah, like, that's something we see throughout gaming. Like in Super Nintendo era, Jurassic Park, you had to get all of the dinosaur eggs. And what's kind of interesting about this is it does go all the way back to Atari. E.T. did it. There's an element we start to see of open worldness in this, because you're not doing like a side scroller or a static screen that you work on. You get to go to different places. You go to different houses to find Freddy's bones. You go to different abstract concepts of places in E.T. to find toys or whatever it was you're trying to get. I can't really. The game I blocked out.
Did you ever play it? Side
note. I played an emulator version of it that didn't quite work, so I got a little bit of a taste of it, and I've watched other people do playthroughs of it to there was kind of a wave of like, okay, we hate on this game a little too hard, so a couple people did episodes of their shows where they really actually showed you the game, and the game's actually very complicated for an Atari game.
Really?
I think
I've only ever seen like screenshots, and I think I watched the AVGN video like years ago.
Yeah, and I think like the Spoony one did one as well, and they were just
Spoony.
Yeah, we're not going there. That's an episode, but I think Down the Rabbit Hole did it about as good as anyone's gonna know. But that becomes another element. As technology kind of goes a little further along, we get near in the arcades, of course, everything's a little bit ahead of the consoles at this point. So we start to get to like the Mortal Kombat era of gaming, just before PlayStation and then into PlayStation. And with computer games, we're in the 90s now. We're starting to see things like FMV, full motion video games. And so one thing that starts getting played with a lot in this era is repurposing film content within the game. So it could be anything from stills, like Street Fighter, the movie, the game, use the same technology as Mortal Kombat to have photographic images as sprites. So in Street Fighter, the movie, the game, you play as like all the move sprites are mapped from characters or actors pretending to be the actors from the movie.
I remember people saying that game was not terrible. It looks all right. Like, I don't know. I like that style. But...
yeah, it's a mixed bag. There are things that were innovated in it, and I'm not an expert on that game, to be honest, that would actually end up being used in later Street Fighter games. So it's got wonky hit detection. I do remember that. Like extra wonky hit detection. And, because you are, there is a weird static chunkiness. Like if you look at the first two Mortal Kombat games, the way they would kind of clunk along because you're using these static frames as opposed to hand-drawn animation or pixel art. You went from a pixel art based series to a Mortal Kombat style game. And so the flow of characters is a little noticeably different. So there's examples like that where they utilize the graphics. There are things where, more like puzzle games where, you beat the thing and then you have a video clip from the movie. Or there's even, I don't know if The Godfather did this, but like sound clips being, like you'll have a polygonal animated character play out a scene from a movie, but they'll use the dialogue, the audio from the movie.
I feel like that'd be perfect for The Godfather.
Yeah. I haven't actually played the Godfather game. I've only read up on that one, but
I like the more modern ones, I guess, by like 10, 15 years ago, I really enjoyed, but that's newer.
Yeah. That's for your episode. No, but yeah, so and impossible to find, terrible game, Pumpkinhead. You actually...
Pumpkinhead?
Yeah, there was a Pumpkinhead game. It was bad. Most of the game was actually really interacting with footage. It was a sort of click on elements in the footage to get items that you needed to solve puzzles. So it was this really weird interdimensional world where you would kind of like travel back in time throughout the movie. And I think it's actually Pumpkinhead 2 that they used, which is terrible.
That's crazy though.
Oh yeah, it's worth looking up. It's a weird experiment in cash grabbing.
I'm gonna check it out though.
Yeah, it's out there. I think there was an old YouTuber, Lord Cat, I think, did an episode on it. I don't know if his stuff's even able to be found anymore from the dark days
Outside the cabin
of the channel we do not talk about. That leaves us in shock and awe sometimes. Anyway, so those are a few things. They tend to involve not necessarily straightforward retellings of movies, but adjacent narratives. Sometimes they're prequels, sequels. Sometimes it's kind of ambiguous where it fits. So another thing with these is they tend to be, even as technology allows for the room to tell a story, they tend to be adjacent narratives. Not always, but they're either like a prequel or a sequel or something more ambiguous. It's not a movie example, but a literary one. There's a cyberpunk series I like called When Gravity Falls, and between that book and its sequel, Fire in the Sun, supposedly the computer game A Circuit's Edge takes place, but it has characters who died in When Gravity Falls, or at least it ended in ways where they would not be like, "Oh, hi, Moab, how are you doing today? Everything's good. You totally didn't unload a needle gun into you in the last book." Um, so, like, sometimes they're just kind of in these weird. So, sometimes it's not really clear what they are. And then there's probably my favorite of all of them, the sidequels. A term I think got coined by the Blade Runner game, which is probably my favorite sort of movie tie-in game. But
I watched reviews on it. Very cool.
yeah, the Westwood Blade Runner game, there's a fan base that has patched it so that people can finally play it again. But for several years, you couldn't play the game. But yeah, you play a different Blade Runner dealing with three or four other replicants that are loose around the same time as the events of Blade Runner are taking place. And another example of that would be the Matrix game. I forget, is it Path of Neo?
There's several.
The one that's...
Yeah, gosh, I actually... it's called The Matrix, Enter the Matrix. I'm pretty sure.
Enter the Matrix, yeah.
Yes.
So it's... in that, it's actually canonical, and it's actually an expansion of the narrative.
There's even FMV, or I guess not FMV, but like actual movie. They made new movie scenes for Enter the Matrix.
Right, yeah, which kind of goes into the thing I said before about repurposing film content. Or actually, I think you were saying that there were new scenes. That
they shot new stuff for that.
Yeah. So yeah, you get these kind of interesting mixes where it's sort of in the same world, just different locations, different kind of cross weave side stories. In a similar vein, you can have, I guess we kind of went over this a little bit, but like basically proximal retellings where it's essentially a parallel universe. Like you are playing that world, but whether it's that sort of level dilation I was talking about, or scene dilation, or just the game just goes off the rails. It's like, we're telling the story of. I think of a good example of this. Well, I'll use True Lies again because nobody played that game, so everyone will know what I'm talking about. But where all of a sudden, places that the character never went to, they go to, and like a dinner party turns into a food fight level, or it's some games would just be like that, where it's the movie, but stuff happens that's not in the movie, and sometimes that's caused by kind of parallel adaptation, where the game's being developed at the same time as the movie. So there's stuff that they put in the game from draft one that didn't make the cut in the movie. I think the Nintendo Goonies did this, where in the game you fight a giant octopus. And there's even a clip, if you listen really carefully, at the end of the movie Goonies, where one of the kids says something, and one of the parents is like, "What? Giant octopus?" And you're like, what are they talking about? Well, there was a scene cut from the movie where the kids fought a giant octopus, and it's not in there. So what the hell is that kid at the end talking about? Well, you can find out in the game where you fight the giant octopus.
I like stuff like that.
Yeah. The other thing, going back to Jurassic Park, that can happen is that because the game is being made relatively at the same time as the movie, the game relies on the source material. So it's not so much an adaptation of the movie, it's an adaptation of the book, which is why you see in, I think, especially the Sega version of Jurassic Park, which is a totally different game, all these river raft levels, because there's a scene in the book where they go down a river and get chased by the T-Rex. And so, yeah, I mean, those are kind of the major trends in the early ones I noticed. Again, they different plays around with, what story you're telling around the other story, or, in relation to it, as opposed to just a straight retelling. Or if they do retell, they had to expand upon it and kind of bloat it out, sometimes making mundane scenes from a movie into either side, multimodal, like a puzzle level, or a different medium, or just, and now ninjas drop out of the ceiling and you have to fight ninjas in the cafeteria, where before you were just asking, talking to the girlfriend about breaking up. A lot of them involve, exploring a world and collecting all of an item to beat the game, but not all. And many of them are reskins, going back to that merchandising aspect. With the early ones, it was, you tried to distill a moment, but if you couldn't really do something like that, sometimes you just package the brand onto a genre. Like the original Alien game, the first one in '82 for the Atari, was essentially Pac-Man. Like, it had a couple tweaks, but you are running around a hallway, which is, you can interpret as the vent shaft scene from Alien, where they're going through, I think it's, what's his name? Not Dallas, but the captain.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in this, you're just trying to destroy all the eggs, which are the Pac-Man little pack balls that he eats. And you're being chased by aliens, and sort of taking a trick from Dig Dug. You've got like a short range flamethrower blast that can stop them temporarily. So those are kind of the building blocks of a lot of it at the start. I think as games move on, one of my favorite things when we look at these as adaptations is ultimately you're taking a passive narrative, something that you read. And yes, I know there are some, movies that have an interactive function, or books that have like choose your own adventure, jumping abilities and choice abilities, but essentially something that you just watch or take in, a passive text, and trying to adapt it to an interactive medium. And something that's been talked about for the last few years in modern gaming, I know, is ludonarrative dissonance, where the narrative is trying to push you one way, but the mechanics of the game compel you to do things in contrast to what your character is supposed to. Grand Theft Auto's the famous one.
I would say a big one too, that I don't know, I consider Uncharted as the reason why that discussion has been brought up more so.
Yes. Yeah, no, definitely. I think Grand Theft Auto came to mind because like the fifth one, they have that character that's basically just a ludonarrative jab at the fans.
Trevor, yeah.
Yeah. It's like, aren't we just supposed to like lay low and slowly take over the city? And then there's one character that's like, I just want to watch things burn because I have the mechanics to do it.
Yeah.
But I think what's funny, and this probably is the most interesting trick to me, is as the games became more able to be narrative based, and looking over some of those parts I just mentioned before. Um, Games based on movies can have, or on any other text, passive text, can have this sort of extra textual ludonarrative dissonance because you go in having presumably watched the movie with certain expectations then of what happens next. And when it goes off the rails or when it deviates, you're both trying to play to one path. The character's trying to go one path. And then, or rather, the mechanics are trying to make you go one path. The story's trying to make you go another path. And then the expectation of the story is making you try to go a third path. I think the best example of this, again, isn't a movie one per se, but the original text-based Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which, if you know the books or the radio series, you will start the game, you will get about, let's say, 30 lines of command into it, going, I got this, I know what I have to do, I need to talk to Ford, I need to lay down in front of the bulldozer, I need to get a stiff beer at the pub, and I need to get from, hitchhike with the Vogon alien ship, and then you get into the ship, and then all of a sudden, nothing is like the book, or virtually nothing is like the book, and so you start trying to make things, thinking you've got that George Patton, you beautiful bastard, I read your book, swagger, and the game's just like, nope, we're gonna go this way, deal with it. So that's something that I don't see much of. I'd almost like to see more of it in some ways, but I think is kind of fun about the potential of game adaptation. And I've been talking a lot. Any questions? How you doing, man?
I love it. I'm chiming in where I am. I feel like I'm learning. Like, this is all, like you said, this is all stuff kind of before my time. I started with the PlayStation 1 era in 64. I played a little bit of SNES when I was a child, but I was so young, and like all I remember is Link to the Past. Really, film adaptations or game adaptations of film weren't really my thing. I played a lot of PS4 movie games, but like, so.
Well, the thing is, no, I was saying the thing is, a lot of them are bad.
Oh yeah, they're awful, but I think there's an enduring charm to them that I love. Like, because it's been a while since we've gotten a lot of movie games. It's like we kind of miss them. They were kind of just always there. Sometimes they tried something different. Sometimes they tried something new. I think there's a lot of worth in bad games sometimes as well.
Yeah. No, I mean there's some of them that just, if you're trying to recreate the story of the movie, they fall flat on their face. But like I remember enjoying Last Action Hero as just like a little side scroller beat 'em up game. It's not a particularly great one, but I beat it.
Yeah.
But as a movie adaptation, I don't know that would hold up that well.
I just get like a simple enjoyment out of watching someone try to adapt a movie. It's like, how did they take this? Like, why did they decide to put that in? Even if it doesn't make sense, even if it is something like just random as such, like ninjas falling from the sky, it's just kind of like, oh, really? Okay, sure,
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think, the Wild West days have passed, and gaming has kind of, well, that may be something better to talk about on your episode, but I think what's interesting is gaming at this point is so much like cinema that that's where we kind of butt heads with it in adaptation. Is we're not, with those earlier games, you were taking elements or even the whole story through some way and transitioning them into something that was not at all like cinema, that, you know, could have dialogue boxes and conversations. It could have maybe cut scenes, but those were still very limited. It was more about the Ludo than the narrative. And so I think that's kind of the challenge for the future ones. So I think,
which is more my side of things, where I get into that future and present,
yes,
how they adapt it and how they die, but maybe come back.
Commencing crossover. So yeah, I mean,
effect.
You know, I think that's I think that's kind of where we are with the cabin on this. You know, we've covered the bases, kind of how we got here. This you know, they started out very much as merchandise, and they started out very much as accessories, basically a glorified toy to be sold with the movie. But then as they moved forward, games became a kind of reaffirmed art form, but also this expansive, massive thing that often, you know, a game today incorporates into like the side quest elements of it, or the downtime elements of it, basically the entirety of prior games. Like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, you can go into an arcade and play classic games. You can play games inside of games. There's a very famous Dreamcast series. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's like a JR. It's not like a conventional JRPG. It's there are Sega fans listening to this that want to kill me right now for not knowing the name of it. But it's a hugely interactive game. Like this was the glut of interactivity in a game. I want to make my dinner. I'll make my dinner. I want to go exercise and eat a meal and go to work. And it's like, what's the plot? The plot is it's a fully interactive world.
Wow. I'm curious what this is.
Yeah, it got...
Shenmue?
Shenmue! That's it, yes.
Shenmue. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
All right, I'm sorry. I should have, I should have...
I was like, it's a Japanese name, and I'm gonna butcher it. And
yeah, Shenmue. Yeah, that's an interesting looking kind of I guess at first a video game trying to touch into film, but ultra. If you're placed inside a film where you can interact with everything if you would want to.
Yeah.
I love Shenmue 1 and 2 and 3. I guess I didn't finish them.
Yeah. So it's interesting, the different kind of leaps that gaming has made in that case. And of course there are retro games and stuff now, but yeah, I think, we're kind of at the point where we should probably go to the consultant room. So thank you for coming over. I look forward to your episode, and fans want to check you out. Give them some direction to see where we finish this conversation of what makes a good video game film adaptation, and where they can hear you.
By all means, I am the Pretentious Nerd's expert consultant, Chris DickRson, and we will be hopping in the computer for part 2.
Thank you, Chris. All right, well, that'll be it for here. We'll see you next time. Hop over there to see us continue this conversation. But until then, stay safe and good night.
Stay alive.